Welcome everybody. I've been asked to come talk to you a little bit about soil health. Let me just make sure I can share my screen and get my slideshow ready and going. Yes, I've got a broad background in soil health and soil sampling. Working for Timac Agro, we advise on crop nutrition. Said it's a bit of a competition to see if you can spot the propaganda and adverts throughout my presentation. I talk a lot around the country on soil and soil health. It's become a sort of very current buzzword, a very current sort of watchword. And this year, with the cost of inputs and so on, it's finding out what you can do with your soil health that can help you to make more of what you have with maybe limited amount of budget for the inputs as they are. So yeah, again, it's a weird thing. It's a fertilizer salesperson advising you on how to use less fertilizer, basically. So where I go from is, why am I giving this talk in the first place? Well, as I just mentioned, we've got a strange economic climate at the moment going on with input prices, feed prices, the way things are with the gas and everything else that's going on at the moment. We also have a changing environmental climate. Climate change is, I think, starting to take effect. I personally have a view that some of the weather changes that we are seeing is down to climate change. There's a lot of talk at the moment about carbon capture. There's a lot of options coming out in terms of things you can do about that. There's been changes to the law over the last few years, one of them being the Water Framework Directive. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. There's changes to your payments. You can't really ignore going on ELMS, or the Sustainable Farming Incentive, as it's now called, and the transition to that. So where do we come from in terms of soil testing? Well, one thing is the Water Framework Directive. If you're not aware of it yet, it's been around for 3 or 4 years. Says that when planning an application of fertilizer or organic manure, so muck as well, to cultivated agricultural land, you must ensure the results of soil sampling analysis are taken into account. So this is the law now, and it's all organic manure and manufactured fertilizer to cultivated agricultural land. And their definition of cultivated agricultural land means by physical means, so that's what I see as cultivating, putting metal through the soil, at least once in the previous year, or by chemical means. This is a new one to me, which is the application of muck or manufactured fertilizer at least once in the previous 3 years. So if you've spread fertilizer or muck on a field within the last 3 years, that is deemed as cultivated, so it needs testing before you can put any more inputs onto it. And that test must include pH, P, K, and magnesium, and must be no more than 5 years old at the time of application. So what they're telling you, our interpretation is that you must test basically most of your farm every 5 years, or 20% of your farm a year. So that's a legal requirement now. The lab crop who we deal with, we use as a lab. The manager there has now heard, we've had like 2 years of them allowing us to let it sink in, but in the last 12 months he's heard of several prosecutions of people who have been over applying manures without any sort of soil testing going on. The other issue we have is that these nutritional additions must be planned. So we need to do nutrition planning. We can't just now justify adding, a couple of underwear at 20-10-10 in the spring because that's what we've always done. We need to justify it, and we need to show that we've planned it. So that's changed. We've also got this thing, this regenerative agriculture around. This is something that's quite a sort of movement that's gaining momentum, but also this sustainable farming incentive, the new ELMS scheme, and how it will work. It's been changed again. So if you thought you knew what it was last year, look again, because they have changed the different levels. What used to be 3 levels available. There's now at the moment only 2. An introductory level and an intermediate level on grassland, and similar on arable soils, but as I say, hopefully we're all talking grassland here today. And it's been simplified. So what you need to do is, the basic level is test your organic matter, undertake a soil assessment and produce a soil management plan. Keep 95% of green cover on your soils, no more than 5% bare ground over winter. And to get to the intermediate level, you need to establish or maintain herbal lays to improve soil health on at least 15% of the land in the standard. They're adding an advanced level again from next year onwards. So again, we're being encouraged to test our soils, so not just P, K, MAG, but also organic matter, and plan what we're doing with our soils. And it's something that people like myself can help you with. Or other consultants. So as Jan said, I visit around, well, in my previous life when I was a salesperson, I used to visit around about 500 farms a year. What did I see? Generally, we saw a lot of soils that weren't in peak condition. So we saw things like shallow rooting in grassland, topsoil foraging, so roots not getting down into the soil. I see a lot of compaction. We'll look at that in a bit more detail a little bit later in this talk. What do I mean by compaction? But I'd say only about, probably, I can say of all the farms I visited, I can count probably on 1 or 2 of my hands how many I've visited that don't have some sort of minor to major issue with compaction. We see soils seem to be drying out much more these days. We see poor establishment. Reseeds might struggle. The spring crops or autumn crops, if you're into your cereals, we're seeing more and more of an issue with establishment. Poor establishment leads to weed competition. The crops seem to be a little lower in vigor. We see pastures burning out quicker. Again, particularly in the dairy industry, where we're intensively grazing or intensively silaging. 5 years lay seem to be now only lasting 3 or 4 years, rather than going the full 5 or 6 years like they should do. What's going on with all of this is mostly down to poor soil health. The soil's drying out. I had an interesting conversation last week in Wiltshire. A farmer there in his senior years who, when he was started 50 years ago, used to have to put weights on fence posts when digging them in to like 3 or 4 feet deep because there's so much water in the hole. And now they can dig down 5 or 6 feet and still not find water. So the theory in the room there was, this was in Wiltshire, was that the local water authority seems to be extracting more from the aquifers underground, and so the water table is dropping. But this is something that we may be needing to deal with. There's more building going on everywhere. There's more demand. There's more people. So what can we do about it? Well, just a quick reminder is crops grow only to the level allowed by their weakest link, by their least available nutrition. Liebig's barrel demonstrates this, that if your staves, your availability of one nutrient is less than others, the plant will only reach, or the crop will only reach that yield that is allowable from that level. I quite like the chain available like that. A chain will only hold, in terms of yield, what its weakest link will allow. So if there's a weak link in your chain, you will never get the yield that you can manage, because the chain will break and fall down and collapse. So when I talk about soil fertility and soil health, what do I mean? In my view, and many other people's view, there are three different aspects to soil fertility. There is a physical aspect of soil fertility, a biological aspect of soil fertility, and a chemical aspect of soil fertility. Now, the physical aspect and chemical aspect we've been well versed with for the last sort of 100 years. Well, the chemical fertility has come on in the last 50 years, physical fertility last 100 or 50 years or so. Looking after your soils and making sure they're in a good condition. Chemical fertility, we're talking about supplying nutrients to the crop, to the soil, and so on, making sure the pH is all right. When we get to the biological fertility, it's something that we thought we haven't had to worry about over the last sort of, since about the Second World War, because we've had these wonderful things called fertilizers that can help feed plants. But what we're learning and what we're finding out and what we're coming to be very aware of these days is that we don't actually feed the plant with fertilizer. What we need to do is we need to feed the soil and allow the soil to feed the plant. If you're going to feed the soil, you need that soil to be alive in order to get those that nutrition to the plant. There's a whole ecosystem beneath our feet that help nutrition get into a plant. Just to give you an idea of how little we really understand about this, only last year they discovered a bacterium which we'd never seen before, we'd never found before, which is critically involved in taking phosphate from the soil and bringing it to a plant's root and making it available to the plant. And for that, the bacteria is fed sugar by the plant to go off and find some more phosphate and bring it to it. And we were totally unaware of this little bug until last year. So we're finding more out about the biological side of fertility, soil fertility, every term, every year. So looking a bit more into the chemical fertility, a quick reminder of the key plant nutrients and their role. So we all know about nitrogen, supplies protein and leafy growth. However, it's inefficient unless the plant is hungry for nutrition, for nitrogen, and sulphur is present. We'll come to that in a minute. Phosphate. Phosphate is for roots. Phosphate is for all growth, all energy in the plant. And that includes nutrient uptake. Phosphate is easily locked up. Potash is for plant health and water management, for stress resistance, and especially in grazing, it's a good, it's well recycled by animals. So they eat grass, it goes in the front end, it comes out the back end quite rapidly. These are the main nutrients that people tend to think about and tend to recognize and seem to know about. However, there's a whole lot more that we need to be aware of in terms of plant nutrition. So there's sulphur. Sulphur I'll look at in detail during this talk because there's quite a large part that we need to know about sulphur, but it's a key part of amino acids, same as nitrogen is. These are the building blocks of protein, part of chlorophyll, part of oils, and grass now needs supplementing with sulphur. Calcium. Calcium, as in animals, is the structural nutrient. So it keeps plants upright, cell walls, but it's also useful in transport and nutrient availability. It helps to transport other nutrients around plants. Without calcium, you don't get good uptake of nitrogen, phosphate, or potash. Magnesium is a key part of chlorophyll. Too much of this can reduce the uptake of other nutrients. Too little of this, and we don't get green plants. We don't get that sugar production, that protein production, that energy within the plant. Organic matter is not a nutrient itself, but is a key part of healthy soil, and it's where plants have evolved to seek their nutrition. Plants are not evolved to get rapid and large amounts of nutrition into themselves, like we supply with things like ammonium nitrate and urea. Plants have evolved to work hard for their nutrition. They grow roots in order to seek nutrition. They are used to a slow and steady release of nutrients. So giving them a large and rapid amount of nutrition, such as by supplying ammonium nitrate or urea, can cause problems, can cause upset, and can cause issues with soil biology. The other thing to consider is not all nutrients are as available or mobile as each other in the soil. Phosphate in particular is a very lazy nutrient. Nitrogen is the party animal. Nitrogen can get around soils. It means that once you put nitrogen on soils, it gets around, it can get into the plants fairly simply. But the issue is that once it's soluble in water, it's also liable for leaching. So it disappears very quickly. It's very transient within soils. Potash bonds to the soil very well and is quite mobile. So again, it's quite an available nutrient. Phosphorus, on the other hand, doesn't move. Once you get it into a soil, get it available to the plant in a water-soluble fashion, a plant root needs to get within 1 millimeter of a piece of phosphorus or phosphate in order for it to be uptaken. So the message there, if you want to have good phosphate uptake, grow more roots. So look after your roots. So make sure that your crop is able to find enough nutrition. There's a fact that is put about by the polysulphate sales guy that 1 centimeter of extra roots within a crop, within a hectare, touches around about an extra 130 tons of soil. So by putting an extra centimeter of roots onto your plant, you're helping that plant find a lot more nutrition within it. I'm skipping through this quite quickly because I'm aware I haven't got a huge amount of time. So carrying on with the chemical fertility side of things, sulphur. I mentioned grass now needs supplementing with sulphur. Why now? Why do we need to supplement with sulphur? Well, in the background there is a graph of the sulfur dioxide emissions or sulfur dioxide within the atmosphere from 1970 to the present day. So in 1970, it was reckoned on average, there was around about 70 kilos of sulfate falling on every hectare of land within the UK. So we were well supplied with sulphur. But since the 1970s, we've been through several decades of cleaning up our act, the Clean Air Act, the reduction in manufacturing in the UK and Northern Europe has reduced the amount of sulphur, it's reduced the amount of acid rain. So now we've gone from 70 kilos falling on every hectare of land to around about 7 kilos of land. Two wiggly lines show how the increase has been in the additions of sulphur applied to winter wheat and oilseed rape, two very susceptible crops to sulphur deficiency. Another very susceptible crop to sulphur deficiency is grassland. Not only is it essential for nitrogen use and for protein, as demonstrated by the right-hand graph here, adding sulphur into silage, but equally it's applicable to grazing, it's applicable to hay, it's applicable to every other sort of grass forage protein content, increases the protein content. But equally, having sulphur within your soil helps nitrogen to be stable within that soil. So, and this isn't our figures, this is a figure from Growhow. In 2015, Growhow became CF, manufacturers of single top, double top, and so on. It's seen that increasing the sulfur content of your soils increases the ability of soils to retain nitrogen for the winter. So you less loss through leaching. Try saying that after a bit. You get equally this synergy between sulfur and nitrogen. If you add nitrogen to a crop, it grows faster. If you add sulfur to a crop, it grows faster. If you add nitrogen and sulfur to a crop, you get an exponential boost in your growth. But the big issue with sulfur is, like nitrogen, once it's in its sulfate form, the plant available form, it's highly soluble in water, so it's highly leachable. So winters where we're getting a lot of rainfall or major rain events will leach the sulfur from your soil. So it needs topping up little and often throughout the season. But what does it do anyway? So protein, I mentioned that, but it's also a constituent of chlorophyll. It assists with the soil storage of nitrogen, which I've touched upon. It increases the digestibility of forage, adding more solid to increase the protein content of forage. I've touched on that a lot. RB209, the fertilizer Bible that advisors like myself work from, recommends that grass now receives 20 to 30 kilos of sulphur per hectare for grazing every year. 40 kilos of sulphur is recommended for each cut of silage or hay. And the reason I'm on about this is I've done a bit of research into this, and it's one of the most neglected applications that we have. And the government fertilizer survey for last year, it was shown that those where it used it were applying 32 kilos of sulphur a hectare, highest on the silage, lowest on hay. So those that were using it were applying a decent amount. The problem is 15% of all grassland was treated with sulphur in their survey, which is fairly low. So it was seen that 50 to 60% of all grassland was receiving some sort of fertilizer input, but only 15% were treated. A lot of the people's excuse is that, especially in livestock systems, is, oh, well, the sulphur comes out of my muck. Muck is actually a very poor provider of sulphur. It's only between 2 and 6%, or 2 and 6 kilos per tonne of sulphur in a farmyard manure, in cattle farmyard manure. Poultry manure is slightly higher. Sheep manure, I would have to check. But just by depositing muck on your soils is not depositing enough sulphur really for what we need these days in order to provide a higher protein product. And if feed is expensive, where do you get your protein from? Where is the cheapest source of protein? The cheapest source of protein is from your grazing. The other issue to talk about that people neglect when prices are high is pH. We look at our liming regime. We think about it, if anybody here is on an acidically tending soil, the soil that tends towards the acid, once you get down to a pH of 6, you're looking at losing 47, 48% of your phosphate as soon as you apply it. Any MOP or 2010-10 or 2755. 40% of that disappears once you get to pH of 6. Get down to pH of 5.5, like I see down here in Cornwall, or even lower. 4.9 is 4.8 a record in my soil testing. You're getting down to only sort of 25 to 30% of anything you apply actually making it to the plant immediately. Leave it for 3 or 4 more days, and most of it has been gone and been locked up by the soils. And what I mean by lock up, it's bonded to other chemicals within the soil. So in acidic conditions, iron and aluminium, which are freely available, and they make the phosphate insoluble, so it's unavailable to the plant. It's locked away. Those of you unlucky enough to be on a chalk or limestone soil with high pHs, the effect is even more rapid. Going from 7 to a pH of 8, you lose 40% again of your phosphate as soon as it's applied to calcium. Get to 8.5, and again, you're down to only 25% of any applied TSP, water-soluble phosphate, being available as soon as you apply it. So those of you with acidic soils, don't neglect liming this year. You with alkaline soils, I do have one glimpse of hope. You can't apply lime, but that doesn't do any effect. But if you grow more roots, roots exude a weak acid. If you increase the root density of your crop, you increase that effect of your roots changing the pH in their immediate vicinity. So if you increase your root density, we've done research to show this, we can reduce the pH by up to 1 point by having really good, strong, tough, concentrated roots underneath the crop, especially things like grass. And if you get that sort of effect, what that can happen then is you can liberate some of your calcium phosphate that you've got locked away within that highly alkaline soil. So again, the story being grow more roots. So yeah, keep an eye on your pH. The other issue with pH, of course, is extremes of pH upset your soil biology. Soil biology works best between a pH of 6.2, 6.3, and about 7.5. If you can do anything to keep your soil biology working well for you, sort out any sorts of acidity. Soil structure, physical fertility. How can we do anything? Well, I'm always sort of amazed by when I go around a room of farmers and ask how many people in the last year have wandered around their farm with a spade to have a look at their soil structure. So whenever I visit a farm, I take a picture of soil structure, especially if it's a good one, like there, or a bad one, like here, or a bad one, like here, or a really bad one, like here. So if you go out with a spade, dig a hole, dig 3 sides around your soil, and you can recognize good soil structure here, where we have no major dominance, no horizontal lines through the soil structure. We have a good variation in aggregate sizes, and we can see that roots are penetrating right from the top right to the bottom of our spade depth. That is a good depth of rooting underneath a nice strong grass crop. Here we have an example of surface compaction. We've got a surface of consolidated soil in the surface here. What this means is that water can't penetrate deep into the soil. When I see this, it's very often caused by livestock. It's very often caused by having livestock out on soils that have got too wet, or over concentration of livestock, overstocking. And what this means is the water can't penetrate. So if we have these heavy rain events, the top surface will soak up a little bit of moisture. Anything else will then just run off down out of the field, down the slope, out the gateway, and so on. And you often find when you dig down, even after a major rain event, you get down to the bottom of the spade, get down a foot or 30 centimeters, depending on your inclination, you'll find dry soil. So there's no reserves of moisture within this soil. So after a week or so, or 2 weeks of dry weather, you get this pasture burnout. Equally, roots don't like a hard life. So you can see in this example here, we haven't got much depth of soil rooting. Opposite of this is deep compaction. Here we've got a lovely, good 4 or 5 inches of soil structure in the surface, but then we run into problems. We've got some horizontal lines, we've got blocky, poor soil structure going down to one consolidated lump right down the bottom. This is often caused by poor or repeated machinery use. So making them, this is your good example of a good old-fashioned plough pat. They've ploughed this field repeatedly to a certain level, and what that means, again, is we've got limited amounts of reserves to hold on to moisture. This one's starting to be broken up. Roots are maybe penetrating down. We've got the odd vertical crack in it, but it's still not ideal. Here, the reason I'm loading these two together is when you dig your hole, don't dig all round all 4 sides, especially if you're in clay soils, because that can give you, or that can hide the issues you've got here and here are actually exactly the same sample. But here is the side that the spade has gone down, and this is a side that was left without the spade going down it. So you can see we've got thatchy grass growth on the surface, but the penetrable roots, a mid layer of compaction, and then we've got some roots making its way through this compaction into the deep layer here, where we've got nice friable soil again. This again is usually machinery caused, and it's usually down to poor seedbed preparation. or overuse of the roller. So my message is to get out and have a look at what you've got, because what you can actually fix compaction relatively cheaply, especially surface compaction, which is the most common I see with sheep use. Because often these days we have sheep out in wet weather. We have the issue with little feet pushing down on maybe a poor sward throughout the winter, causing this surface consolidation. So what can we do about it? Again, I like to present this to a room where I can see people and get them to stick their hands up. How many people have got one of these, and how often do you actually use it? These are brilliant tools, especially for surface compaction. They are excellent for soil biology. An old wise head who, when I first joined our company, said, if you want people to think that our products are working really, really well, get them to apply them at the same time to slit it, because the first thing they'll see is the grass go green, and you can stand there and say, well, that's all our products working. Well, half of the issue is getting oxygen into the soil, and sward slitters are brilliant at getting oxygen into the soil. They provide a route to get oxygen into those roots so that they can work better, so they're happy to penetrate deeper into the grass. It also gives a route for water to penetrate deeper into soil. The other option for sorting out compaction is a bit more severe. These things, subsoilers, sumos, or whatever you want to call them, are great pieces of kit at sorting out any sorts of compaction. Downside is that they are expensive to use. You need serious horsepower to pull one of these things. So it's usually down to a contractor, it's usually down to a major intervention, and your land has to be suitable to use it. Down here in Cornwall, we have quite a lot of granite land with boulders in it the size of a small car, and they don't get on well with subsoilers. So, you know, you need the right land to be able to use them. Slitters, quite happy to bounce over most sort of surfaces. Slitters, I recommend you use them if you have one at least twice a year, once in the spring, once in the autumn, because there's a Goldilocks moment when the soil is ready for a slitter. It's when it's still wet enough or just getting wet enough to penetrate all the way down, but not so wet that you're damaging the soil further by driving over it. So there is that sort of Goldilocks time of using a soil slitter. And there's people I know who will drop everything when the soil is right to go slitting, because it's important to them to make sure that they keep their soils in the optimum condition. And it saves you a lot of money in fertilizer using these things properly. So the other thing to look after is nature's little helpers, your unseen workforce, or sometimes occasionally you see these things. Worms. Everybody needs worms. I was ashamed to be talking to an amenity forum last night, and they were discussing ways of getting rid of worms because they don't like worm casts on cricket pitches because it moves the ball around, or in golf courses it upsets the direction of putting apparently. I like to encourage worms as much as possible. In one of those spits of soil that I showed you earlier, I would like to see, in decent conditions, and decent conditions I mean moist soil that's above 5 degrees in temperature, I would like to see 10 worms in most of the spits that you dig. And again, in my time, it's rare that I find 10 or more worms in soils, because soils these days, worms are not encouraged. You can't see these buggers. Bacteria, fungi, you can see evidence of it, white molds and toadstools and so on. These work very hard to release nutrition from your organic matter. Bacteria are strongly involved in turning organic matter into ammonium and ammonium into nitrate. This is a natural process, goes on in your soils all the time. Bacteria work at any temperature above around about 5 degrees is when they start to wake up. Fungi, they'll work at colder degrees. They work going down to sort of 1 or 2 degrees. If you think about putting cheese in your fridge at Christmas, it still goes moldy. So, you know, fungi are still working at them. Fungi are very good at breaking down woody materials, so straw, muck, manure, and so on. Bacteria prefer to work on the more mushy stuff. So your, the actual straight manure, straight out the back ends of your animals, bacteria like to get to work on those as well. So you need to help these things. As I said, pH 6.5 to 7.5. Don't disturb your soil too often. Don't plow too often. Don't add too much nutrition at any one time. Because ideal conditions for biological fertility, what are we talking about here? We're talking about having good physical fertility. So for biological activity to work, you need moisture and you need air. Living things need air and water to live. You need good chemical fertility. So by that, I mean pH, P, K, sulfur, magnesium, calcium to be balanced, not excessive amounts of either one or the other. And if you have excessive amounts of magnesium or potash down to either your soils or historical applications of muck or manure or so on, adding calcium is a really good way of balancing this out, even in alkaline, calcium-rich soils. Adding a soluble source of calcium is a very good way of balancing out these issues. As I said, pH matters to sort it out. Assess and fix your compaction. Worms irritated by ammonium nitrate and urea, so don't apply too much in any one go. This is usually aimed at the dairy farmers. Bacteria are suppressed by equally excess applications of nitrogen, phosphate and potash. If there's lots of nitrogen around, the bacteria that convert your organic matter into nitrogen are seen as not needed, so they don't multiply so rapidly. So applying lots of freely available nitrogen to soils reduces the biological fertility of your soil. Fungi need a stable soil, so they don't like ploughing because they grow these microfilaments throughout the soils, and they like a pH of 6 to 7.5. So where do we come in? Well, we work on a basis called soil conditioning. We start out with a raw material, which is marine calcium. It used to be calcified seaweed. We're not allowed to use that anymore. We're not allowed to dredge it anymore because it's a protected environment. The calcified seaweed was a coral. It used to, be harvested right outside my front door here over in Truro River in Falmouth. But it's now protected, so we can't use that anymore. So we use now ground up seashells from sustainable sources. So sustainable that the Soil Association deem us organic. The benefit of this, the marine calcium, is that it's very, very soluble, very, very quickly, very freely available. But not only that, it is persistent within the soil. So it's quickly available, lasts for a while within the soil. The other benefit is that, so we get this rapid buffering of pH, but the other benefit is that it is naturally rich in trace elements. So being a seashell in the sea, the seashells gather boron, iodine, selenium, cobalt, manganese, molybdenum, zinc into themselves. And so this marine calcium source also has a trace element within it. So from this, we make products called soil condition, one of them being PHYSIOLITH. This is based on marine calcium, as I said, but we put into that a seaweed extract, which encourages rooting. And what this means is that it's very useful in terms of establishing a seed. It encourages extra root growth. It's a very quick and easily usable bagged line. You can spread it through a fertilizer spreader. And what we have here in my hands is I've got a grass that was treated with PHYSIOLITH. We've got grass that wasn't treated with PHYSIOLITH in an adjacent field. And this is the soil profile of this grass establishment after 18 months. So looking at establishing good roots, keeping that root growth going throughout the soil profile. We have another one which is used on established grassland, which is called HUMISTART, and this encourages root organic matter breakdown to give you more nutrition from what you have already in your soils, in your organic matter. It works to encourage bacteria and fungi within the soils. So if you're using muck or if you're spreading any sort of strawy material on your soils, if you have any of this sort of thatchy old style grassland, HUMISTART can help that break down and liberate nutrition from your soils. It releases a lot more nitrogen from your soils, up to sort of 40 to 50 extra kilos of nitrogen per year. So it's time to think different and farm better, maybe. Sort out your chemical fertility, correct the pH. I think I'm sort of quite emphasizing the pH side of things. Use a plant-friendly fertilizer in moderation. Don't over-apply at any one time of year. Sort out your physical fertility. Look at your cultivations if appropriate, if you have cultivations, if you've got cultivations going on. Aerate your soils. Balance your soils with sulphur, magnesium, particularly calcium. Look after your biological fertility. Utilize your organic matter. Use soil-friendly fertilizers. And keep your nutrients in balance. How do you keep your nutrients in balance? Test your soils to understand where they are. You have to now. So get a soil test, understand what you're going. If you don't understand a soil test, get advice. There are people out there who will give free advice. Condition your soils and only spray when necessary. The other thing to think about is, when are you applying your nutrition? If you're applying TSP right at the start of the season, when it's cold and wet and damp, how long is that TSP going to be available for? And when does a plant really need it? A plant really needs nutrition when it's growing at its most rapid rate, or just before. So with grass, that is April, May, June. Up to flowering. The highest demand is just before flowering. So if you're making hay, the highest phosphate demand is literally that last 3 or 4 weeks just before heading, just before you get that full height crop. So if you're applying phosphate very early in the season, if you've got issues with pH, is that phosphate going to be available? We've done trials as well looking at soil conditioning and what effect that can have on the soils, because adding calcium and making more nutrition available by encouraging your soil biology, encouraging your release of more balanced nutrition, making sure that you have better soil structure, not only increases the yield. In this case, this was a reseed on a silage cutting system. The only difference between the two, the grey graph and the green graph, was that we applied a soil conditioner. The first cut was higher in yield, higher in protein, higher in energy. And again, what are we trying to avoid at the moment is avoiding the use of bought-in feeds, or reducing the amount of bought-in feeds. By having good conditioned soil, by having soil with its biology and its physical capabilities optimized, we're producing a better quality grass, less bought-in feed needed for finishing lambs and so on. In fact, I went through a bit of a calculation on another trial we did on permanent pasture, where the only effect we saw was an increase. We kept the quality around about the same, the MEs around about the same, 11.5, 11.6, but we increased the yield by 0.5 ton of dry matter per hectare. So 0.5 ton of dry matter per hectare, what does that mean? That means that we produced an extra 5,240 megajoules of energy per hectare. According to the HDB, one lamb requires 1,250 megajoules to go from birth to 40 kilos. So by producing 500,000 extra megajoules per hectare, each hectare will produce 4.2 extra lambs. Or 200 lambs require 0.3 hectares less ground to finish with this situation. In this case, for us, our investment for the HUMISTART was £154 a hectare. So one lamb, I'm not sure, I'm always sort of wary of putting in a price for lamb, because the lamb price seems to be quite changeable throughout the year. So hopefully I'm quite safe in saying £100 a lamb as a rough idea at a return, gross return. So an extra 4 lambs per hectare gives you an extra £400 maybe per hectare gross return on your £154 investment. So we have this issue at the moment. The fertilizer is very expensive. So the first natural reaction is to throw your hands up and say, I'm not going to use as much fertilizer. However, we're talking about the cheapest feed. So spring grazing, finishing ground for your lambs. If you put maybe, just in this example, 375 kilo, 300 weight an acre fertilizer onto spring grazing. Last year, fertilizer may have cost around about £300 a tonne, £112 a hectare, £45 an acre is what you spent. This year, the fertilizers are around about £650 a tonne. This is, you know, everybody's fertilizers are around about £650 a tonne. So this year that spend is £243 a hectare, £97, over double the cost. So what can we do? My inclination, thinking about this, is how can we, for an investment on our soils in time, effort, and so on, how can we make that fertilizer work better to grow more nutrition so that we can utilize maybe slightly less land to finish our lambs, or slightly more lambs on the same amount of ground, depending on your system, what is right for you. So our extra fertilizer cost of £131 per hectare, roughly 1.3 extra lambs need to finish per hectare in order to pay for that fertilizer. All of the other costs are the same as last year, which of course they're not. Diesel's more expensive, feed's more expensive, electricity and so on. Everything's gone up. But this is a way of thinking, or changing the way you're thinking about your investments. So, you know, adding in a soil conditioner, or adding in extra cost of maybe soiling your land or something else like that. Think of it in number of terms of lands that you have to add to your soil. The points to consider. What are the main enterprise performance indicators on your system? What has the biggest influence on your profit? Finishing time, finished land percentage, your replacement rate, the amount of bought-in feed, so on. What is it that you can influence easily and best in order to deliver the best improvement to your system? Because we do need to improve our systems. These changes we're seeing are not transient. They are going to, some of them are going to be around for some time. With what's happening in Ukraine, I don't see the gas price coming down anytime soon. How confident are you your current fertilizer stocks and system will provide enough forage this year? What reserves can you utilize? Do you have muck, manure, barn reserves? Do you have other ways in which, or systems which you can apply to your soils in order to make the most of them? What are you going to do differently this year? And based on what return? As I say, cost is not necessarily the best driver. Just continually trimming costs and reducing costs means that once you get down to the basics, you start to trim costs that are essential to produce decent quality forage. And when you stop producing decent quality forage, you can actually increase your costs very rapidly by making up for a lack of decent quality forage. And are your soils truly in the best shape to cope with low inputs, and have you checked? The other thing to think about is, are you and your business prepared for the consequences of losing single farm payment? That's going on in the background too. What else can you do to overcome this reduction in the single farm payment? How can we help? I mean, when I say we, I'm talking from a point of Timac. Of course, they pay my bills, but there are other advisors out there that can help equally as well. Soil assessment and testing. We've got a special offer on for our soil assessment and testing for you. We will happily do you a soil test. Send us some soil. There's the special offer details, I think, are going into the chat. We'll send you out a bag and a prepaid envelope. Put a bit of your soil into that soil prepaid envelope. We'll send it off. We'll get it tested, and we'll put together a nutrition management plan for that soil that you have sent us for free. Timac obviously can offer soil conditioning, adding calcium, buffering pHs, enhancing rooting, feeding bugs. We also have slow release fertilizer technology within our arsenal. So we have this approach, our company. We deal with premium products, we deal with high prices. We want farmers to utilize our products and not be penalized for it. So we look at the whole farm, we look at the whole farm cycle. We're not just crop nutrition. One of our mottos is healthy soil, healthy plant, healthy animal. We look at the whole system because we don't only have crops, and we have another offer going as well, because we produce these blocks, these nutritional blocks, which are different from your average just mineral blocks. We have extra rumen stimulation, extra antioxidants in there, extra zinc in there. We also do bedding conditioners, bedding sanitizers, which have an unsurpassed drying action and ammonium capture. We also, for the NSA, are doing a special offer based around half pallet or pallet offers of zinc blocks and Actizan for lambing, so that these things can help out in order to make sure that you are getting the best return on your animals. You're getting the healthiest lambs, the greatest percentages, and making the most of the effort you're putting into your flocks. That healthy soil, healthy plant, healthy animal. Here endeth the propaganda. Where does it start from? Testing your soils. I can't emphasize enough about getting a soil test, getting your soils tested, going out with a spade, go and dig your soils, go and see what you're dealing with. Because unless you know what you're dealing with, you can't tailor your nutrition, you can't make sensible savings in your applications. So again, if you don't understand a soil test, you don't understand how to read a soil test, talk to someone who'll do it to you, do it for you, and maybe give you advice on what you're doing. So that's me done. Are there any questions from anybody out there in the Zoom world?